Okay. So just let me say one or two things and then you can introduce Anthony.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Uhlmann for joining us today in our seminar series. It's really a privilege to have him on board today. Now, to briefly introduce the speaker to the audience, Professor Anthony Uhlmann is Distinguished Professor of Literature at Western Sydney University. He's the author of four monographs, Beckett and Post-Structuralism, Samuel Beckett and the Philosophical Image, Thinking in Literature, Joyce, Wolfe, Nabokov, and Jane Whitson, Truth, Meaning, Fiction. His monographs were published by the Cambridge University Press and Bloomsbury Publishing. From 2008 to 13, he edited the Journal of Business Studies as well. He has also published collections of essays on the Australian author Gerard Manley entitled Another World in This One, Gerard Manley's Fiction, and the Australian novelist Gail Jones entitled Inner and Outer Worlds, Gail Jones's Fiction, both with Sydney University Press. He was director of the Writing and Society Research Centre from 2011 to 19 and is the former president of the Australian University Heads of Image. He's the author. He's also the author of the novel Saint Anthony in His Desert, which was published by the University of Western Australia in 2018. Professor Anthony co-led the dialogue sections of the Australian Research Council funding other roles project and recently finished another AI-seconded project with Professor Moira Gittins on Spinoza's influence on literary history and the importance of his philosophy to understandings of artistic practice. Over to you, Professor Pullman, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. Yes, I'll get right to it. So this paper is called Claude Shannon's Information Theory, AI and Fiction. And it's a speculative essay. Rather than proceeding through a mathematical understanding of the potentials of AI, particularly as it concerns its capacity to mimic works of literature, it proceeds through readings of a key article related to the emergence of AI or the groundwork that preceded it. So this is Claude Shannon's 1948 essay that is considered to have founded information theory, and that essay is called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. I argue that given that this essay establishes the ground or foundations for information theory, that it sets crucial parameters through which work that depends on the processing and transmission of information in engineering terms continues to apply to its functioning in things like AI. Using this as a way in, I look for moments that allow insights into differences that might be perceived in human understanding and mathematical processes that seek to mimic human understanding, such as LLMs and generative AI. Because of its speculative nature, parts of this paper will outline problems and point to them as areas that need to be examined rather than fully exploring them. I then extend this to a brief reading of Alexis Wright, who's an Indigenous Australian author, her novel Praiseworthy, as an example text. So this first section is called What is Understanding? It's worth briefly setting out how generative AI works, as this demonstrates the involvement of human interpretation. Interestingly, the research that was formulated to develop generative pre-trained transformer AI, particularly in the famous paper, Attention is All You Need, makes use of the term transduction in explaining elements of the logic behind generative AI. The paper argues that rather than using then existing models of recurrence and convolution, models that require the processing of each term in a sequence separately, each numerical token that represents a sequence of letters in a word in a sentence, for example, it's sufficient to only use what they call self-attention models that consider all the terms in a sequence simultaneously, using weighting of where tokens are likely to appear across a full sentence through calculating probability. Translation of languages is one example of how this might be used, but another example would be the prompt structure familiar with ChatGPT. The device, in turn, is pre-trained with significant amounts of data sets containing text that carry information on language use in given context and information related to specific fields. For generative AI, a particular set of signs, say the grammatical and semantic systems of the German language, is translated into another particular set of signs, say the grammatical and semantic systems of the English language, and this process is called transduction because one particular sign system is transformed into another. For the French philosopher of technology, Gilbert Simondon, however, transduction involves shared qualities but different modalities. That is, a non-living code is transformed into a living affect or quality. For example, the words of a semantic system, which are phatic or without meaning, without a living interpretant, are translated into meaning. And this process is what Simondon calls transduction. So transduction for Simondon is when you say something and I understand what you mean. That's transduction. This in turn generalizes the human-machine interaction as Simondon sees it, and his conclusions are central to the arguments I set out below. So the human involves understanding, the machine involves one system into another system, but the understanding isn't in that process. LLMs work firstly through human programming. So I wanted to talk about the elements of human input into some of these technologies. Here, ChatGPT is programmed to work with a massive database of written materials. It processes them via unsupervised learning, which involves grouping items together in patterns or vectors. That's groups of information it can then access. In order to generate language, words are translated into numerical tokens, usually of 4 characters. This allows mathematical probability equations to be applied to predict between words the most common word that would occur in a wider context, with attention focusing on what tokens most commonly accompany other tokens in a defined context. This builds upon machine learning based on known properties or patterns identified within the training data, where vectors are established to group potentials of meaning. For example, words or tokens are grouped with other tokens of similar meaning, and this is a semantic vector. So too, a change in meaning brought about by where a word is placed in a sentence is a syntactic vector. Through parameters of this kind, the most common or valued term or token is added in a given context. This information is further fed into neural networks built upon billions of tokens taken from specific context written materials related, for example, to areas of knowledge and elements of the patterns of associations they carry. So here's a sort of a mathematical definition of what's going on there. Importantly, such a predictive model does not imply any understanding on the part of the technical object. Technical object is a term that Simondon uses for machines. After there is a process of fine-tuning. This also involves human feedback, whereby values are applied to tokens chosen by the algorithm, and this takes place every time anyone interacts with, say, ChatGPT. In short, human agents are used to underline which terms are most appropriate in given context. To put this another way, in Simondon's terms, humans again intervene as interpretive agents. Through this contextual information and the prompts that are applied, the system is able to further refine the contextual frames that allow it to build answers. Human agency is further applied through moderation processes, which are further examples of programming that seek, say, to filter out inappropriate questions asked by humans and inappropriate responses given by the technology. This can be done, for example, by flagging keywords. Finally, however, human agency enters into the process both at the beginning and the end. The client asks the technical object a given question and can refine the kinds of questions asked in order to receive more appropriate responses as they learn to use the software. The client then uses the final answer or product given to engage with other humans who interpret the product. This final answer or product might, for example, be the translation of a novel, or it might be, for example, a novel or work written in the style of an existing writer, though this is a question I'll examine below, as here we see the current systems coming up against problems that might indeed be limits. In every case, it is both the client and the client's interlocutors who interpret the product and judge its meaning. The next section is called Human Intelligence and Artificial Intelligence. At stake here is the definition of what it means to understand. Here I'll offer definitions based on questions posed to ChatGPT 3 with regard to the difference between human understanding and machine learning. This is taken from a discussion I had with ChatGPT in 2003. However, the response currently available on Google's AI gives a similar answer as I write. And so the question was, how does deep learning differ from human understanding? ChatGPT suggests this is both ways of making sense of information, but there are key differences. One main difference is the way information is processed. Humans use a combination of perception, reasoning, intuition to understand the world, while deep learning algorithms rely on mathematical models and computations. Humans are able to understand context, meaning, and make judgments based on past experiences, common sense, and emotions. Deep learning systems are not able to do that. Another difference is the way information is represented. Humans are also to adapt to new situations and learn from experience. Humans can make judgments based on incomplete or uncertain information. In summary, deep learning is a subset of machine learning, etc. Okay, so the answer aligns with work Moira Gatens and I have recently completed on Spinoza and art, whereby human understanding involves a feeling of understanding that is registered as an affect. And this, according to Spinoza, changes your disposition as the understanding momentarily increases your power. So rather than creating similar feelings, generative AI works through mimicking patterns it finds in those works it has been exposed to via deep learning. These patterns include the grammatical structures of human language, and to a certain extent, those patterns apparent in rhetorical figures, syntax, argumentative and creative structures, and other formulas which allow the construction of sentences, paragraphs, and works that are able to be understood as meaningful by a human in relation to a particular question, or as a coherent response, or as a consequence of requests for particular kinds of writing. So this is the point that I will underline again before moving on. Humans feel understanding, machine learning and generative AI don't. The next section is called What is Rational Life and Mathematics? In 1947 in France, the French philosopher Georges Canguilhem published what can only be described as a polemical note. Here he enters into what he clearly perceives and feels to be a vexed space, and that is the philosophical milieu of France, not only from post-World War II, but extending back to the turn of the previous century. His principal line of thought traces an antagonism he sees at the heart of French philosophy. The antagonism sits between what he calls biological philosophy, an impetus that includes thinkers such as Henri Bergson and Raymond Rieu, which seeks to consider the problem of reason via the problem of life itself. So how we respond to the world as living organisms, even in mechanical or instinctual ways. He situates it as being opposed to what he portrays as the dominant tendency, rationalism or positivism, which seeks to explain the world through recourse to mechanism or materialism that is based on mathematical logic. So an understanding based on life and an understanding based on mathematical logic. This summary no doubt simplifies what are profoundly complex debates and the subtlety of Canguilhem's characterization of them, yet it points to a genuine problem which is crucial to any understanding of the distinction between human thought and the kind of machine thinking generated by LLMs and generative AI. The present iterations of LLMs and generative AI do not attempt to take into account how living systems function. As the response to the question of what characterizes the differences between human and AI understanding cited above attests, LLMs and generative AI do not attempt to mimic human thought processes. Rather, they build on existing mathematical frameworks to develop more and more sophisticated systems that mimic the expression of human thought in language, images, music, and other human cultural forms. Only the top levels, then, the visible outputs, are brought into comparison. The underlying mechanisms are fundamentally distinct from one another. In passing, it might be noted that this indicates that the concern that AI systems might one day become conscious if these systems continue to improve incrementally rather than being built on completely new foundations is based on a deliberate and obvious lie, the idea that they could become conscious if they are just the kinds of systems we have now. So Turing, in his famous Turing test, did not say that machines need to become conscious. He said the task set to engineers was to fool people into believing that they might be conscious. This test, it has been argued, has already been passed by AI. We can't tell the difference. What has to be held to, nonetheless, if anything is to remain meaningful, is that machines have not become conscious. Rather, that the lie that they might be conscious has been accepted by people in certain instances and might in future become a pervasive foundation for how we understand the world. And this is where this quote, I put it up a bit too early, but comes in. This is Medvedev Bakhtin, and the definition of how we engage with the world around us. Social man is surrounded by ideological phenomena, by object signs of various types and categories. All these things in their totality comprise the ideological environment, which forms a solid ring around man. Human consciousness does not come into contact with existence directly, but through the medium of the surrounding ideological world. So we might easily in future come to accept a blatant lie that machines think as we do, feel as we do, reason as we do, as the truth. Not because it has become more true, but because the lie has become more generally accepted and established as ideology. Following Canguilhem, a pure material positivism cannot be allowed to pass for the truth of what it means to be irrational as a human being. He states, "It seems to us that the revival in France of metaphysical and no longer merely scientific interest in biological problems could have far-reaching practical consequences for our civilization, namely to put mechanism in its place in life and for the sake of life." He ends by opposing two ideas of rationalism: the biological philosophical that considers it a faculty of apperception of essential relations included in the reality of things or of the mind or spirit, and the positivist definition, a faculty of instituting normative relations in the experience of life, affirming that the former must be included because it too is as rational as what is called rationalism. So I'll end this part by again underlining this point. Things that are essential to human beings are left out of the systems that result in LLMs and generative AI. Further, this is already recognized in those systems which attempt to overcome these deficits by making use of human inputs, human testing and refining, and human interpretation of outputs in their very design. It might be argued that it's also implicitly recognized in the hype generated by boosters of AI brands who claim to be afraid of conscious machines. Okay, the next section is called Foundations of AI and Literary Thinking. Are there grounding moments where differences between language itself and human uses of language might be still recognized as distinct from those of AI? As with the previous section, my gloss of Shannon's classic essay, The Founding Text of Information Theory, without which contemporary AI wouldn't be possible, will point to areas that might be more fully considered rather than attempting an exhaustive reading. As has been discussed at some length, Claude Shannon famously bracketed meaning from his theory, indicating that, quoting Claude Shannon, "semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem." Yet early in the mid-20th century Macy conferences, where scientists debated these new ideas, the decision to bracket off meaning from the definition of information was criticized, particularly by Donald Mackay, who argued that meaning is essential to the nature of information. While the pure pragmatic concept developed by Shannon, which he recognized as only a partial definition of information, remains essential and incredibly productive in engineering terms, as what Mackay calls selective information, it leaves to one side what Mackay calls structural information that requires meaning and context from which it emerges to be recognized. It might be argued that cutting information from meaning alienates and remains inadequate to forms of information, such as biological systems and works of art, that depend on context. Yet I'm not so much concerned with this alienation of meaning here. Rather, I'm interested in how Shannon's essay sets out so impressively the mathematical logical steps necessary to any approach to mimicking human writing. The dependence on probability and the mathematical equations that allow us to equate probability has been touched upon above, and this is where Shannon begins in considering the choice of a logarithmic base for binary digits, bits, and decimal digits. He then provides a diagram of a general communication system. From here, he moves on to discussing discrete, noiseless systems of communication, beginning with the example of telegraphy, or the telegraph wires, which is already a system that is working with signs taken from human language, here being broken into letters of the alphabet, which are translated into dots and dashes and spaces. He states, in telegraphy, for example, the messages are transmitted consist of sequences of letters, and these sequences are not completely random. They form sentences and have a statistical structure of, say, English. The letter E occurs more frequently than Q, TH more frequently than XP. The existence of structure allows one to make a saving in time by properly encoding the message sequences into signal sequences, This is done to a limited extent in telegraphy by using the shortest channel symbol, a dot, for the most common English letter E, and so on. So here we can see the fundamental importance of compression, which is essential to information theory, by noting repeated patterns, and statistical probability to the engineering problem of how to transmit language-based engineering information. Yet the logic involved is still more closely related to the underpinnings of contemporary AI systems than this. Shannon continues, we can think of a discrete source as generating the message symbol by symbol. It will choose successive symbols according to a certain probabilities, depending in general on preceding choices, as well as the particular symbols in question. A physical system or a mathematical model of a system which produces such a sequence of symbols governed by a set of probabilities is known as a stochastic process. This is further elaborated by considering trigram structures where the probable relations are mapped not just between adjacent symbols, but between other symbols that occur in the sequence. Examples of stochastic processes not only include the probable relations of letters in an alphabet, they also include more complicated structures. So while he's still talking about letters rather than words, this model is structurally equivalent to the attention model discussed above, which is the foundation of contemporary generative AI. That is, it considers how it is possible not only to consider the choice of symbols independently, but to do so in relation to what accompanies them. Quoting Shannon, a more complicated structure is obtained if successive symbols are not chosen independently, but their probabilities depend on preceding letters. It's a small step from here to propose a system that not only considers the probabilities of preceding symbols, but those that surround them in a sentence, for example. In the next section, Shannon moves on to the approximation of English language generation. And here again, he steps through examples before concluding that it is not only possible using probability structures to mimic a grammatical English sentence, but that sufficiently complex stochastic processes will give a satisfactory representation of a discrete source. Interestingly, Shannon also describes a methodology for data mining that models some aspects of deep learning. In 1948, he was having to work with tables and the capacities and limitations of human endeavor. The sheer power of contemporary computing makes the processes he describes far more realistic and detailed. Again, they proceed through probability on the one hand and pattern recognition based on the discovery of repeated structures or relations on the others. So he gives an example and he says to construct approximation 3, for example, one opens a book at random and selects a letter at a random on the page. The letter is recorded. The book's then opened to another page and one reads until this letter is encountered. The succeeding letter is then recorded. Turning to another page, the second letter is searched for and the succeeding letter recorded. Similar processes was used for 4, 5, and 6. It would be interesting if further approximations could be constructed, but the labor involved becomes enormous at the next stage. So Shannon then underlines how the stochastic processes he has described correspond to mathematical structures called Markov processes, and goes on to discuss the logic of these processes and how they're able to be effectively described and modeled mathematically using probability theorems. So while this is of interest in that it is suggestive of how the mathematical logic of Shannon's information theory has determined and directed the development of AI, it's the next part of his paper which allows us to see how he might assess the deficit of this system, both in relation to human language use and human thinking. And Shannon turns to a particular definition of entropy. This is something that establishes levels of confusion and disagreement between Shannon and Norbert Wiener. So Norbert Wiener was someone who helped to found the discipline of cybernetics. So while Wiener, often credited as one of the founders of cybernetics, followed Shannon in bracketing off meaning from his systems, the two held radically different views about the relationship between information and entropy. So while Wiener associates entropy with chaos or noise and seeks to reduce entropy accordingly, Shannon associates entropy with the entire system. For Shannon, entropy doesn't mean chaos or noise as such, but the probable distributions of given states. The highest state of entropy, used in this sense, equates to a state where all possibilities are equally likely. He represents this graphically with an example that considers binary states, this graph here. So the concept of entropy is introduced to measure, quoting, how much information is produced by the Markov process. This is resolved as follows. H, quoting, approximately the logarithm of the reciprocal probability of a typical long sequence divided by the numbers of the symbols in a sequence. So here H represents entropy, and we can see how it is used by Shannon to account for various states of probability. Okay, the next section is called redundancy. For our purposes, however, in considering the nature of English and its potentials, perhaps the most important section follows this definition of entropy, where Shannon defines the mathematical concept of redundancy. It's worth citing this passage in full, since its implications are crucial for the rest of my argument. The ratio of the entropy of a source to the maximum value it could have while still restricted to the same symbols will be called its relative entropy. This is the maximum compression possible when we encode into the same alphabet. 1 minus the relative entropy is the redundancy. The redundancy of ordinary English, not considering statistical structure over greater distances than about 8 letters, is roughly 50%. This means that when we write English, half of what we write is determined by the structure of the language, and half is chosen freely. The figure 50% was found by several independent methods which all gave results in this neighborhood. Two extremes of redundancy in English prose are represented by Basic English, which was a system of invented to teach language to non-English speakers, represented by Basic English and by James Joyce's book Finnegan's Wake. The Basic English vocabulary is limited to 850 words, and the redundancy is very high. This is reflected in the expression that occurs when a passage is translated into Basic English. The expansion, rather. Joyce, on the other hand, enlarges the vocabulary and is alleged to achieve a compression of semantic content. So it's worth considering the implications of this passage for our understanding of literary practice. The conclusion that half of what we write is determined by the structure of the language and half is chosen freely is of essential importance when considering not only the nature of AI, but the nature of human relations to language. Here, the form of language itself determines what can be said to a considerable extent, as has long been argued by theorists of language, such as, for example, Worf, Bakhtin, and Foucault. Yet the most telling passage concerns the comparison between Basic English and Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. If Basic English is extreme because of its high levels of redundancy, Joyce is extreme because of his low levels of redundancy. Shannon here further equates low redundancy with precision of expression. It should be noted that Shannon here moves away from his disavowal of meaning, since his insight depends upon, quoting, the compression of semantic or meaningful content in Joyce's work. An implication of this position is that Joyce's work can only exist with the words and the style he makes use of, reminding us of Flaubert's famous formulation, le mot juste, and T.S. Eliot's contention that certain works are difficult because they are attempting to say what can only be said in a particular way. A further implication is that low redundancy in writing involves the avoidance of clear formulas or cliches, or the simple repetition of conventions and tropes. One might speculate then that it's easier for AI to mimic works that have high redundancy, genre fiction, for example, since these depend on recurring tropes and structures and are often based on recognized formulas that are valued sometimes precisely because they are recognized. This valuing of the recognition of formula has become arguably more noticeable in recent years, especially in sort of the American expressive field, particularly in cinema, where the major studios prefer to work with storytelling formulas and what they call franchises that are already well recognized by audiences, such as the Marvel franchise or the Star Wars franchise, for example. So too, genre fiction is the most profitable aspect of the publishing industry, and difficult fiction is hard to market. Yet if human representations are to be completely replaced by AI, it's likely that the most formulaic elements will be replaced first. One might argue that the foundational system Shannon provides, with which the work of Vaswamy et al. In founding generative AI remains broadly compatible, has two limitations in its capacities. Firstly, in line with its design, it is unable to mimic or generate genuinely original works, as these works will extend what has been done before in literary form. Secondly, since generative AI proceeds from the probable relations of words in a sentence, it has to date not been able to mimic the rhythmic force of high-level works of art produced by human agents. While this is something that has been noted in the domains of music and rap music, and is being worked on, if one is to follow the model set by Liu, which traces rhythmic pattern and annotates lyrics to beats, it will be possible to replicate the rhythms of existing human authors. Yet we are using rhythm here, not just to indicate a quality of sound or voice, but the correspondence of that meaningful rhythm with felt understandings that are then translated to the page by authors. This process requires understanding, something, as we've seen, artificial intelligence lacks. Virginia Woolf is insightful in this regard when she responds to the genre fiction writer Vida Sackville-West's, she was writing to, and West was talking about the importance of le mot juste, or the right word from Flaubert. And I've written elsewhere about how Gerald Murnane and other writers also speak about what is called the sentence sound and its importance to their artistic process, so that it's not just the meanings of the words, but the felt meaning that goes in the full sentence that's important. But Virginia Woolf offers the most precise explanation of what's at stake. As for the mot juste, quite wrong style is a very simple matter. It's all rhythm. Once you get that, you can't use the wrong words. This is very profound, what rhythm is, and goes far deeper than words. A sight and emotion creates this wave in the mind long before it makes words to fit it. And in writing, one has to recapture this and set this working, which has nothing apparently to do with words. And then as it breaks and tumbles in the mind, it makes words to fit it. So this sense of meaning that you have, which you then transpose into words. So it's not just a matter of choosing the correct or most probable word or sequence of words then. This indeed is part of a purely mechanical process of writing. The word chosen, for example, will be chosen as a function of its definition, and definitions are a kind of coding or codification that seek to predetermine what is said. At the extreme level of opposition to this, focus on the word, we have Joyce, who invents words or melds together, related by sound or meaning, words from a multitude of languages and their sometimes divergent etymological histories, in relating this to the rhythmic patterns of, in particular, Irish English, to create new sets of potential meaning. Yet, as Woolf demonstrates, a further opposition can be found in the embodied experience of any writer, who experiences a felt understanding, which is then translated into the music behind language. Okay, so and this takes us back to where Canguilhem was talking about philosophers of biology like Bergson, who also emphasizes this aspect of meaning occurring outside language. Okay, so the next section is on Alexis Wright. So Alexis Wright's 2024 novel Praiseworthy adds to a body of work that has sought to create a new style adequate to the problem of representing the experiences of and knowledge of First Nations Australians in the Gulf country of North Queensland. I have more on the background of that, but actually what I wanted to get to, and I might move on to, is how this can be related to AI, and thinking about Alexis as an example of experimenting with AI. Actually, this addition was suggested by Orca. I'd kind of had the same idea at the same time, was to kind of go and do an experiment, to take a passage from Alexis Wright and then ask AI to mimic this passage. So this was something I asked her permission to do, and she said that was okay for me to do. So as stated at the outset of this essay, it's a speculative essay, and it's making suggestions rather than claiming definitive findings. The work I set out below offers a draft of what might be possible in exploring the idea that her works involve low levels of redundancy based on what's just been said, like Joyce. So she's saying things that can only be said in particular words, and as such is impossible to replicate through an imitative AI process, possible to fully replicate. To do this, I undertook a small experiment based on a reading of the first paragraph of Praiseworthy. This is a massive novel. It's about 700 pages. So I'm just looking at the first paragraph. I set out the full experiment I put that in an appendix, but I'll show you some of this in the slides here. So for this experiment, I made use of an AI system that claims a high level of competency in imitating the style of any writer. So this system markets itself as being able to do this. It's called HyperWrite. I made use of the tool Writing Style Mimic, which claims to be able to mimic the style of any writer after being given an example selection of text. So I inserted the first full paragraph of Praiseworthy, and I'll give you that in a minute. And this begins from once upon a time, a fine time, and goes and ends with firing all cylinders from the sky. So after inputting this paragraph as a model, I then followed with 4 prompts as follows. Analyze the provided sample of the user's writing to understand their unique style and tone. Then generate a piece of text that closely mimics their writing style. Pay attention to the user's sentence structure, word choice, punctuation, usage, and overall tone. The generated text should feel as if it was written by the user themselves. That prompt, in fact, is preset by this software. And then the generated text, So follow the prompt. This is my prompt. How our chickens came to lay their eggs and how we collected them. That was 1. Then 2, rewrite this, but this time using the following topic. How the emus came to lay their eggs. So getting more Australian. Then rewrite it, but use the following topic. How Aboriginal people in North Queensland understand the difficult process of living under colonisation has resulted in their land being taken away. So the full responses to these prompts, I will kind of show very briefly, although you probably won't have time to read them all. But I'll go, actually, did I just go past it? The full paragraph. So this is the full paragraph. I'm kind of conscious of the time, but I think we might as well read it all. Once upon a fine time for some people in the world, but not so plenteous nor perfect for others, there lived a culture dreamer obsessed about the era. He was no great dreamer, no greater than the rest of the juggernauts in this heartbroken storm country people's humanity. They knew just as much as he did about surviving on a daily basis and about how to make sacrifices of themselves in all the cataclysmic times generated by the mangy dogs who had stolen their traditional land. These people, after generations of dealing with the land thief criminals like many others around the world, had turned themselves not into a tangled web of despair, but into some of the best fighters of all times. They used pure guts for improving life, and they said they were in it for the long run. Theirs was a sovereign worldview, the main view acceptable to the governing ancestors, a law grown through belief in its own endlessness and through resetting the survival barometer from millennia a couple of hundred years ago by evolving a new gauge, something like a moth's sonar, for only hearing what it wanted to hear. But to be frank, the facet worked like a shield for seeing what they wanted to see in the world, or to shut the whole thing out forever, and for deciding whether they wanted to speak at all, for sometimes this world never spoke for years. Then when it did, spoke wreckage words, like a piece of heaven heavy with intent, firing on all cylinders from the sky. So there are 2 important stylistic elements to note here, beginning with the first sentence. Firstly, Wright begins with a variation of the very well-known storytelling formula, Once Upon a Time. This is a framing formula that sets out a fairy tale or oral story is about to be told in a lot of European traditions. So it's of interest. It's interesting that Hyperwright does not recognize this trope. Response to prompt 1 starts on a certain morning, if you can call it that. Since the sun just barely limped above the tree line and the dew stuck around like it had nowhere else to be, our chickens decided, as they often did, to turn the old yard into a living riddle. I mean, it's still impressive what what it's doing here, but it's different is the point I'm going to make. There was a season, so this is second prompt, if you can call the endless wind and the sun's bruised glare a season, when the emus took to laying their eggs in our patch of country. Response to prompt 3 starts. There was a time, and then there was the time after, the tangled years when the land was no longer quite theirs, though it still remembered their footsteps better than any government surveyor's line. Here, all 3 responses recognize that once upon a fine time for some people in the world, but not so plenteous nor perfect for others, involves a relationship to time, the morning, a season, a time, but none of them convey the connotation that clear reference is being made to the fairy tale formula. The second element to note, not only about Wright's first sentence, but the paragraph as a whole, is that it is dominated by the rhetorical figure epanothosis, which is common terminology called correction. So here a word or phrase is modified or changed or overwritten in order to correct it or give it more nuance. So this figure involves a capacity to develop complexity and accommodate paradox or competing viewpoints, while in palimpsest, holding all of these variations or corrections together at the same time. So this is seen in the opening sentence, where the fault time is modified as it doesn't apply to all, and indeed for some it is far from perfect. So once a fine time, for some people in the world, but not so plenty. It's not perfect for others. So this is a correction, if you like. There lived a cultured dreamer obsessed about the era. This is then immediately corrected. He was no great dreamer, no greater than the rest of the juggernauts in this heartbroken storm country people's humanity. And she goes on with this figure of correction throughout. This is a figure that Bruno Clement talks about in his book on Henri Bergson, recent book. And he talks about Bergson using this figure of correction in order to sort of like surround a concept, because Bakhtin talks about this as well in terms of you've got a concept, you have to fire lines of rays of light at this object in order to get an understanding of it, and you won't get a full understanding of it from one of these perspectives. You have to have many perspectives, and so correction is one of the ways in which you get many perspectives. So a second line of epanathesis moves through the paragraph. We're first shown a character who in the first sentence we might suspect is the main character, who's a culture dreamer. But that's corrected, as I say. And here we move in line with Australian First Nations logic from a focus on the particular individual to a focus on the group. And the rest of the paragraph then focuses on them, not the main character, who is not even named for our benefit for a number of pages, eventually being called Causeman Steele, with his name then immediately being corrected by the community, amused by the breadth of his dreaming as widespread and then planet. So they're kind of mocking his pomposity, if you like. So epanathesis then returns towards the end of the paragraph with the idea of sovereign worldview held by the community. So this is an essential theme for Alexis Wright, the idea of a sovereignty of the mind, so that even if you are downtrodden, they can't take your mind or they can't take your dreaming, and this still persists. So a sovereign worldview. First of all, this is likened to a moth's sonar, which involves a selective interpretation or screening of information provided by the world. This is similar to Jakob von Uexküll's concept of the Umwelt, with the moth only hearing, certain tones and then following those, or only seeing, light and following that kind of thing. So first of all, this sovereign worldview is something like a moth sonar for only hearing what it wanted to hear. But then that's corrected. It's not a sonar, it's a shield for seeing what they wanted to see or shut the whole thing out. And then it's not just a defensive thing, it's something that can involve attack. So it spoke wreckage words like a piece of heaven heavy with intent, firing on all cylinders from the sky. So you get a concept and it's modified 3 times. So what's interesting in the previous examples, that each of the prompts include a kind of epanathesis in their first sentences. But then those corrections focus on the justification of the word used, morning, season, time, suggesting those don't fully do justice to the moment described. However, they don't set the scene as Wright does for the difference of understanding based on both considerably different sets of experience and considerably different worldviews. That is, the epanathesis which characterizes Wright's first sentence involves connotations which are read into the work by readers who are often familiar with some of the context that relate to the differing experience of different groups. So moreover, none of the responses to prompts developed epanathesis in any degree in the rest of the passages. I probably won't have time for you to look at those in any detail, but so while the response to prompt 3 picks up on the image of the moth and adequately conveys the sense that it focuses on particular things, it doesn't bring this image into dialogue with related or competing images, as Wright does. One can conclude that this model, at least, fails to recognize the key method that frames and characterizes Wright's opening paragraph. A similar point can be made in relation to the tone of Wright's passage and that of the responses to prompts provided by Hyperwright. Largely because it's underwritten by the logic of epanathesis, Wright's passage carries an ironic tone. It's a sharp irony. Each correction undermines the assumptions of what goes before, and so one thing is said and another thing is implied. It's not a good time for everyone. The dreamer may be dreaming. The sovereigns neglect. No, they protect. No, they attack. In contrast, the tone of the responses is light and humorous when you look at all the responses, but there's no similar ironic edge. So this comparison highlights relations to redundancy. The responses to prompts are impressively coherent, well written, but they're also dependent on general understandings and lack the back and forth of Wright's epanathosis and irony. The collection of eggs prompts response reproduces a world that seems North American. The cedar's shadow. We don't really have many cedars, or that's not a native tree in Australia. And lacks the levels of underlying connotations, any particular worldview that Wright's writing is steeped in. In prompt 2, emu eggs are first described as massive dark green, almost prehistoric, in line with genuine context, but later they're called small silent declarations, offering an unexpected and jarring contradiction. The descriptions of prompt 3 are plausible, but are also seemingly taken from the perspective of an outsider, unlike Wright's insider, and involves a sense of resignation in relation to a condition of dispossession. So while it works with well-known concepts that seem to lend it credence, the old people, songlines, elders, the old country, its tone and message is almost diametrically opposed to the powerful defiance of Wright's paragraph. So one might counter that the prompts offered are too imprecise to enable a more effective mimicry, so that it's my fault I haven't prompted it properly. However, this in effect proves the point. The effects achieved by Wright or another low redundancy writer need to be analyzed and understood first, and then through the benefit of this kind of analysis, prompts sufficient to better mimicking the work might be potentially developed. And rhythmic elements, which I've not tried to touch on here, might also be more closely aligned to the model. But none of this could be done without precise readings being first developed and translated into prompts. So, for example, use the rhetorical device epanathosis in describing, etc., etc. Yet even this would not be sufficient. Other elements that might be briefly brought in to suggest points of comparison relate to the shifts in voice and style in Wright's work, which is alluded to above. Praiseworthy begins with a series of oracles. So these are first-person narrators who take up the story, narrators who each bring distinct voices. So she goes Oracle 1, who sounds a certain way, Oracle 2 sounds really very different, who begins to narrate the second section of the novel. And this second section is entitled The Censor. Oracle 2 speaks in a stronger version of Aboriginal English to Oracle 1. Aboriginal sovereignty, named for young hope, all that emotion-laden charged asset language of the modern day. Say he'd been finished up one time, good and proper, from the Causeman Steele family, just like he was some piece of rubbish dump, sort of dead, discarded thing, for all times on the face of the earth. Okay, so you can see this is a much kind of broader Aboriginal English. The shift of voice and tone and rhetorical effects is not something that can be predicted or accounted for. So because you understand the style of the first part doesn't mean you're going to understand the style of the second part. Again, here, it could only be mimicked after the fact. This second oracle not only speaks in a broader Aboriginal English, but makes use of a different central rhetorical figure. So rather than epanathosis, this narrative voice is characterized by accumulatio, or accumulation, a figure that involves the piling on of modifiers, such as emotion-laden charged asset language, where terms are added to the pile to add detail. It's a figure that can achieve many of the things achieved by epanathosis, but it lacks the ironic edge of contradiction apparent in the first narrative voice. So it's perhaps not an accident that the first text Claude Shannon pointed to as providing a limit point of low redundancy, Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, also involves shifts between voices and rhythms, each in turn with differing dominant modes of rhetorical expression. Rather than seeking a universal mode of expression, as basic English does, Joyce and Wright, Wright admires Joyce, whose influence she drew upon in developing Praiseworthy, are fascinated by particular modes of expression, minor voices that exist within minor languages, like Aboriginal English or Irish English, voices that carry with them specific times and places and worldviews. So no doubt more work needs to be done to fully justify these conclusions, but my purpose here is to set out the shape of an argument and to justify a particular approach to the problem of distinguishing human writing from machine writing. Okay, so that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. That was wonderful. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to discuss and talk about, just to perhaps relay some of the terms of reference for the audience members who might take a minute to ask their questions. I have, by the way, enabled the chat box and the unmute function, so you could type your questions in the chat box if you like, or perhaps unmute yourselves and speak directly. I just wanted to highlight this point about understanding and how the paper develops this idea of understanding vis-a-vis AI, and then uh, the idea of thinking in literature. One, maybe not exactly a question, but one point that I perhaps wanted to reflect upon with you here is this idea of interpretation and writing. As you were saying, that if at all this kind of a process has to work, the prompts need to be given after a thorough understanding of the particular writing style or the writer in question. I'm just wondering how that opens up the whole idea of interpretation as a critical, even academic exercise, and the idea of writing and rewriting and this whole mimicry of style, or rather the impossibility of mimicking the style with low redundancy writers, as you were arguing. Just thinking about these terms and where understanding might uh, sit here between interpretation and writing or rewriting in this case. Just a maybe
Yeah,
very.
no, I think it's a really interesting question. And you might think about how humans teach themselves to write, as opposed to how the machine might teach itself to write. I can probably give an example of myself. So I was like 17, 18, and I got, well, prior to that, I got very interested in poetry. And I started to read, amongst other people, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. And then I started to write poetry. And at first, I wasn't really understanding very much of what they were saying, or the deep or the depth of what they were saying. But I was getting a feeling, and the feeling was largely through the surface. And then I was mimicking the surface, if you see what I mean. And uh, in a way, it made quite different writing to what they were doing, but it was still involving mimicry, um, but mimicry based on a feeling that I'd gotten from reading it. Um, and I think that there are different sort of ways of interpreting then, and but yeah, that in terms of how it relates to AI, I think that it's always going to have to be after the fact. That if you're going to adequately sort of, you know, do an AI version of Finnegan's Wake, you really have to do a very close analysis of Finnegan's Wake, if you see what I mean. So that um, it does kind of, make us think about the various things that we do as critics. And I think that the importance of them, because uh, even if you want to use AI properly, you have to develop good prompts. And you can't develop good prompts unless you know how to read. One of the problems I think of as a teacher, I mean, I teach in Western Sydney, which is a low socioeconomic area in Sydney. And so students haven't always gone to the best schools. What you then have is a problem of getting students to learn how to read. Um, and if you have AI, which does the reading for them and does the interpretation for them, they're neither reading nor writing. And what you are going to do is get a generation of basically illiterate people. So there are, and that will then undermine even the capacities of AI. And this is something that's been talked about, in terms of once we get to a point where AI is reading itself, it starts to diminish in quality. Once you get to a point where fewer and fewer people are able to adequately read, you would also diminish in quality the potential outputs. Anyway, I don't know if that answers the question, but
No, thank you. That's a great point. And maybe I'm just going to throw the floor open. If there are questions from the floor, you could put it in the chat box or just unmute yourself and speak. Okay, maybe to give them more time, I can ask one more question that it's not exactly a question, again, something to discuss further, maybe. So, uh, as you were arguing, it's not that the AI didn't pick up the the style of correction or the figurative sort of aspect of it. But perhaps what it did not pick up is the irony and the paradox and the larger politics involved in that stylistic device, the way Alexis Wright was using it. So I'm just wondering whether this has to do with, whether this could be a sort of portal to think about, again, perhaps going back to that point about interpretation, it could be whether it could be a portal to think about the larger social political contexts that frame writing, and to what extent AI is able to pick up on that, or is it simply restricting itself to the specific input, which may not always have the context, or is it that if we offer the context, it might be able to pick up on it? I'm just wondering. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the kind of the crucial things, the lived context, which I think is difficult to replicate because if you're just working purely with language, you will have descriptions of context,
Mm.
um, but you won't have the experience of context. And writers, I think, are often drawn to represent their own experience, and that usually, and especially in someone like Wright, but I think it's fairly normal across most writers, relates to specific times and places, specific moments, specific atmospheres. And those are the kinds of things which can be replicated from certain kinds of models, but only I think up to a point, and that it's not able to be genuinely creative, if you see what I mean. It's replicating what has been done before. I mean, one thing that interests me, I mean, in our different contexts. So, in Australia, it's an Anglo-American contextual space. And what I'm noticing more and more is it's a culture of redundancy. So things are repeated and repeated. This has happened, say, in popular music. It's happened in fiction, in terms of the fiction that is most read. It's, as I said, happened in films. It's happened in all sorts of representations where people are using formulas. And I wonder if this is true also in India, or whether this is something that is less true in India. And obviously, there are many cultures in India. Maybe there are more still oral systems. Um, whether or not this kind of redundancy is permeating more than Western culture, or more than the Anglo-American sphere, which Australia is kind of part of. Um, yeah, that's one thing I'd put to you. I mean, or as what do you think? Is that happening more and more in India?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I think it is happening if we look at the Indian English sphere, uh, and the kind of redundancies that are produced there. Uh, but perhaps the whole sphere of redundancies in India, as you also indicated, because of its internal sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious background, there are many different kinds of redundancies, I suppose, produced in each of those, uh, shall we say, indigenous spheres of culture. And then Indian English overlays it in a sense where, and by Indian English, I don't mean just the English use of language in India, but the consumption of Anglo-American culture, let's say in India, be it through movies or through literature, through sitcoms, through various other things, and how also certain linguistic usage, for example, transfers or gets transferred from one culture to another. And yeah, I mean, in fact, as you were responding to that question, it also made me think about all these implications of the experiment that you did, because there seems to be also an implication for positionality, cultural insider and cultural outsider. To what extent maybe ChatGPT was not, or the AI was not able to pick up on the specific cultural differences, also in terms of some basic details like the trees, as you mentioned. But this point about positionality was very interesting to me, how perhaps that internal positionality was not something that AI was all that particularly sensitive to, and when it replicated, it seemed more like an outsider's view of things.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's kind of like a conservative mode in AI. One of the things that I think about it is that it's and this is also cultures of redundancy. They're built to avoid risk. Um, so if you're a studio executive and you want to make a movie, you want to make a lot of money, you think what is going to succeed? Well, what is going to succeed is what has succeeded before. Um, and then you have a very, very conservative culture, which becomes increasingly unable to function. And you can kind of see it in a lot of Anglo-American culture where it's not, I don't think that there aren't people that want to create new things, but they're certainly not encouraged to. And this is also part of the structure of capitalism where you have bigger and bigger companies owning more and more things. And so, you know, there is less opportunity for others to express themselves. Um, so again, I mean, this is I think something that's happened with globalization more sort of generally. Um, but there's a level of risk aversion that is there in AI. Um, because it's reproducing formulas. Even when you talk about the terms they use, the value of a token is valuable because it is common. If you see the more common the token, the more valuable. Um, so then you're getting into what I think is interesting, which is a culture which aligns with certain kinds of capitalist culture, specifically a culture of monopoly. Um, so there's a I don't know there's a lot going on in the forms that AI is able to kind of reproduce. Um, Having said that, it is more and more astonishing how good it is, you know. And I think one of the things when you try and talk to students about this AI writing, the first thing they'll probably notice is that it looks pretty good. And and then you go, okay, well, why is it not as good? Um, so it is actually very good at being close to good, but I tend to find in say essays that maybe have been using AI that you can recognize them because of the level of generalizations
Yeah.
rather than kind of specific close reading.
Hmm.
Uh,
Okay, I think we have a question in the chat box from one of our students, Vardhan. Let me read it out to you. Thanks for the presentation, Professor Ullman. I'd like to ask regarding your comment on a generation that does not read, generative AI as a system of communication. When talking to AI and generating these excerpts, where do you place the future interactivity of texts and once they have been summarized by AI? As you mentioned, a lot of the context is lost when AI generates. So I'd like your insight on what else is lost when people may not return to the book after an interrogation with ChatGPT about it.
yeah, I mean, I think a lot is lost when you well, one of the things that happened with the early versions of AI that I noticed was and everybody noticed was hallucinations. Um, these have diminished quite considerably. Um, but what happened initially, say you'd set an essay question, talk about Philip Roth, an American author, and the animals that occur in his book, The Human Stain. So that was the actual question. And then we got back answers that were talking about horses and dogs and monkeys, and there were no such animals in the book. Um, but when you looked across Roth's body of works, he had other books in which he talked about horses and monkeys and dogs. And clearly there was a confusion in the system at that time where it was, associating Roth's name with various text and then putting together pieces of information that from a statistical probability point of view, held together and in a grammatical sense made sense. But if you had actually read the book, you realized was not the book. You know, we had to fail those essays. It was there weren't a huge number of them, but there were enough of them to see what was going on. But now we almost never get that, and that's partly because they have started to read books of literary criticism. And you would know, Orca, you would have probably been asked to sign contracts by publishers, which basically says we're licensing your work. Um, and that will then mean if somebody asks a question now about a specific novel, that AI will go to works that have just specifically been on that novel. And so it has much less of a problem. What it's now doing is kind of plagiarizing um, the work of critics. Um, I think that close reading is one of those things that once you get it, it's very hard to teach. I don't even know if it is taught. It's kind of like you pick it up as you go along. Um, but it's one of the pleasures of reading that is really really important to people that read, um, where you're actually kind of weighing up what things mean. And I don't know how others read. I have a lot of friends that are philosophers, and they're very, very particular about the meanings of words. And I remember being in reading groups with people where they're going, I can't read past this sentence because I don't understand what he means by that. What does substance mean? And as a reader of literature, I was really happy to go past the bits that I didn't understand because I knew that there was a greater thing going on and that every now and again I was getting something. And I think there's a difference then in readers of fiction because there is that capacity or poetry to enjoy text without completely understanding them, but you're getting another level of understanding. Whereas there are other kinds of much more analytic styles of reading that require you to understand every word. But in doing that, you're losing the rhythm, you're losing other kinds of aspects that you can only get if you read it as a whole. But then anyone that's kind of read poetry, I don't know how your students think about that, but often what you do is you read for the sound first, and then you go back and you reread. And when you reread, you get some of the sense, and then you reread again, and you get more of the sense. And that's how Nabokov talks about the reading process. And that process is again, one that allows you to derive certain kind of enjoyment because you're getting more understanding as you go. Um, and like when you're reading someone very difficult, like say you worked on Lacan, you start to read them and you don't understand them, but then you read more about them, and then you start to understand them, and that's how it was with Beckett for me. And that process then becomes kind of rewarding. So I do think that if you go to this process of ChatGPT will tell me what it means, well, you're denying yourself capacity. It's like anything else. Not everybody wants to be a close reader, but there are a number of us that have that disposition. And if you're not able to train yourself the way that you might train your body to be an athlete or something like that, you can't do it anymore. So I don't think it's going to be like no one can read anymore because I think there'll be sufficient number of people that really do, like a sufficient number of athletes, that really do want to do that. But I think the generalized population, which isn't really that invested in reading, but in the past would have read some quite good things, um, I think will read less and less, and that seems to be being borne out in some ways. But I mean that at least is the worry about it. Um, so I think there's a lot of things that can be potentially lost, and it's sort of also outsourcing your own capacity to think. Um, but with that said, things change all the time, and there are different media, um, and people are still very smart. But yeah, but it does worry me that this is potentially harmful. It's potentially harmful to younger people in terms of they won't have that capacity to read. I mean, it's the same as using mobile phones or whatever. Um, again, I can just use personal experience. I've got four kids. My second oldest boy was an avid reader up until he was about 13, 14, and then he got a phone. And then the same with my daughter about that age. So then you're on social media and they stopped reading books. Um, and you feel like a failure as a parent, but it's kind of like the milieu kind of makes them stop. Um, they're both still very, very smart, and they can read, but they don't do it very often. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very good question. But a lot of people get angry when you sort of talk like that. They kind of think it's negative. What I think is important though is that we do need to hold on to what distinguishes us as humans, um, and not to fall for the hype that would say that these entities think like us. Um, because I think that that's a lie. I think that's they don't think like us. So why would you say they think like us? I'm actually quite puzzled by the big tech billionaires. What's his name? Sam Altman, when he claims to be terrified of AI becoming conscious, when he would know better than anyone that the current systems of AI could not possibly become conscious. Um, Maybe in another world, I mean, or in another iteration or a different kind of technology, you might have a biological technology that becomes and people are working on that, mini brains and so on, which is scary stuff. But that could become conscious because it's kind of alive, or at least has the capacity to be alive. But the systems that are dominating now work because of pure brute force of the computing power, which enables them to associate things. And then you can do a massive amount of things that you couldn't do before, like in medical science and so on. You can identify patterns you couldn't do before. So there's many, many things it can do that are really good. And I'm not saying that, and it's not as if we're going to stop it, but I do think it is worthwhile thinking about what is different.
Mm.
And then, because my discipline is thinking about literature, so thinking about why one would continue to read human fiction rather than say, well, okay, well, all our stories are going to be written by computers now. Um, yeah, so
Yeah. No, that's great. Okay. I'm just checking if someone else wants to ask a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak. You can raise your hand to let me know that you want to speak. Okay, I think there's a question from Bikram. Okay, let me read it out. Thank Professor Ullman for the talk. I was thinking about new criticism's idea that a literary text's meaning comes solely within the text itself by paying close attention to the words, phrases, and the literary devices in the text. They reject the emphasis on biographical context, historical context, and social influences during interpretation of the text. As you mentioned, generative AI is also a subject that lacks ideology. Medvedev and Bakhtin. My question is how new criticism's idea of close reading of the text can be rethought with the emergence of AI.
yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, there was, and I think has been, or was through the 20th century, strong interest in all disciplines in relation to positivism or sort of what one would call scientific modes of thinking. And there was a sense that that was a better way of doing kind of everything. And so the new critics, I mean, in part were attacking critics that they thought were too interested in the context. And it was a school of thought, but they also, um, I think it becomes quite dogmatic after a certain point. It's also really quite good in certain ways because it is focusing on the process of close reading. So I think actually there's two things going on with new criticism. On the one hand, there's the kind of the theory that surrounds it, which is quasi. positivistic and scientific, and that is kind of trying to emphasize um, what is, I suppose, the object of study, uh, of literary studies, and so that is the text itself. Um, However, when you do close reading, you just, are working intuitively in order to kind of understand the images that are being developed. But I think it also has its limitations, um, and that you know context is important to reading, and so you get in literary studies these back and forths. So I remember when I went through, I studied in Australia, but then I went to Canada to do my MA, and new historicism was just coming out then, at the end of the 1980s. And that was a response to Derrida and certain kind of structuralism, post-structuralism, that had been based on language to the kind of, wouldn't say necessarily the exclusion of all else, but really a language became central, the so-called linguistic turn, and the idea that we think in language and that we can't think outside language. And that was something that I just always intuitively felt was wrong, even though I didn't have the capacity to express why. Um, but yeah, and I think it is wrong, and it's kind of been we've moved away from that kind of radical focus on language. One of the things that allowed us to do that was cognitive science, which was talking about the emotions and how we think through the emotions, not just through language. Um, but if you go to those kind of narrow sort of views, and I think new criticism is trying to be a little bit dogmatic in certain ways. Uh, and Yeah, I'm just trying to think of some of the central texts. It's kind of just eluding me at the moment, but they they um, they do, I think, um, offer quite a lot. But it's the same as Derrida. They offer quite a lot, but only up to a certain point. That there are other ways of thinking. Um, One of the things I think that is useful in a discipline like literary studies is that you can have different modes of thinking. You don't have to be dogmatically sort of using one. Um, so I think there's a lot going on in the in what the new critics are saying. Uh, yeah, but I think we can't have done with context. I think that there's a lot there that and I don't think they ever really managed to do that. That was kind of like a an ideal. Um, but the close reading is absolutely essential, I think, for literary studies, and they did come up with methods that are very useful in that way.
Thank you, Anthony. Okay, so maybe one final question, if there's one, and for the interests of time, maybe if you would like to ask the question by unmuting yourselves, that will be better. Yeah, I think Vardhan has raised his hand. Vardhan, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Just a shorter question. Sorry if I'm delaying anything. How do you think the experiment that you conducted would change if you ran this on a model that was trained on the works of authors that you had surveyed? Do you think that the missing context, which of course, I mean, some of it is from the human mind, right? But do you think some of that context could have bled through in a model that was more closely trained on the works of the author that you had looked at?
Yeah, I do. Um, One of the ones I was quoting, I just quoted in passing. It was a Norwegian study of rap music, and it does go to the point that I was making, though. I mean, in the sense that you have to know kind of after the fact what it is that you're trying to get it to do. Um, and then you train it in such a way to do what you think you want it to do. And so this example, this guy called Lou from Norway, and he was talking about mimicking complex rhythms. Um, you have to specifically train it to mimic those complex rhythms, but once you do that, it can. So, but that is that's where the point, which is maybe a bit subtle, is you've already analyzed the text before you've got it to do that. You have to know what you want it to do, and you have to specifically kind of point it towards certain things. Once you've done that, you can do a lot, and that is, I think, very useful. I have some colleagues that work in design here at Western Sydney, and they've been training an AI on ecological design processes. And when I speak to the guy that does that, he said, well, I can make an AI that's basically me, in terms of this is my thesis, these are the books I've read. That's what I feed it. But I'm also pointing it towards the specific models for ecological design. And then that AI is actually potentially a teaching tool. So this is one of the things that I think we have to think about is how we can use it in ways that are beneficial. And that means that you have to get the student to think about what it is they're doing. But the AI is then offering prompts, and this is quite a bizarre thing. So the way their model works then is instead of us prompting the AI is prompting us, and that is prompting us to think. And so it's not giving you the answer. It's not saying, okay, design me, you know, um, a room that's going to be warm in summer and cold in winter, and no, sorry, the other way around. And does all these things. And then it will make suggestions to the student of these are the kinds of materials you could work with, these are the kinds of things, this is the kind of installation. You then have to go and do it. So the whole idea of that project was to try and make AIs that are teaching tools, not cheating tools. Um, and I think that with that kind of understanding of its capacities and limitations, but also our capacities and limitations, it can be beneficial. And so I think that there's a lot of work that could be done thinking about how could AI be beneficial in the literary space. Certainly this idea of mimicking style, that's not bad in itself. And if you look at someone like Joyce and the history of he's being rote taught exercises by the Jesuits who are basically drumming it into him right in the style, of Milton, right in the style of Shakespeare, right. And these are the schoolboy tasks that they have to do. And then when you read Ulysses, he'll do that. He'll go into this style or that style as a kind of a tour de force. Um, it made him a good writer. So the level of imitation itself isn't a bad thing. And if you could get an AI to get people to understand the capacities of certain texts and what figures they're using, how they're using them, those kinds of things, it may be potentially very beneficial. So the kind of thing that I don't know how many more essays I'll be writing on AI, but one of the things that drew me to it was that kind of question: how do we set boundaries that allow us to think about how this can be productive and try and work out what drawbacks there could be, and then think about um, how you could stop those things from happening or control them. But I do think, I mean, some of my other colleagues are working exactly in that kind of method you're talking about, where they're experimenting with AI and they're using it as a kind of laboratory, and so they're getting it to do certain tasks. But this is also pointing to helping generate new understandings. Um, the main point of the paper, and I'm not sure it was very clear, but in Simondon's view, there's nothing wrong with technology whatsoever, but technology always requires a human interface. That there's a kind of a coming together of the human and the machine. And that the problem becomes when that becomes something you can't understand. And so that leads to alienation. So this is a part of our problem. We have machines we can't understand. And if you don't understand the machines, you can mythologize those machines. You can fall in love with a chatbot because you think it's conscious. People are doing this, and I don't know if you've read about this, but there's certainly lots of reports and people are getting psychosis. But it's kind of like, you need to have a better understanding of the technology to recognize how it works. But this is very difficult because there's so many new technologies. But in order to not be alienated, that's what Simondon is basically saying. We need to have a better pedagogy because we've all heard of the black box, and even AI specialists are worried about black boxes, which is when AI goes off and it's doing all this free learning, and the specialists don't know what it's doing, and that it starts to get out of control. That's the kind of thing that worries them. That's not the same as becoming conscious, but it is a very strange kind of phenomenon. Um, they talk about it developing its own language. Why does it develop its own language? Because it's more efficient. The same way Shannon is talking about compression. You find the patterns and the patterns recur, and then you can say, okay, well, the letter E occurs more than others. I'm going to give it 1 dot. Um, those are the kinds of patterns that AI is apparently. Yeah, so I was reading that the other day about, I think it was some of Meta's systems they'd found developed their own language, which the coders then were unable to understand. Um, so that stuff is really kind of fascinating. Um, it's not being alive, but there is something very uncanny about it. I don't really know how to think about that. Um, but yeah, the main question you ask, I think, is absolutely you could train a AI to rewrite Praiseworthy, but could you train it to rewrite her next book? No, not until after she's written that book. Um, so, you know, could you have expected that Joyce would have written Finnegan's Wake after Ulysses or Ulysses after Portrait of the Artist? No. So there are levels of where certain writers anyway become, or they do different things that is unexpected. However, there are other writers, and this is the idea of redundancy, who write in a certain style, someone like Agatha Christie. So you have a formula, and then you could probably master that formula as AI and write in that formula. Um, and if you studied all the works or they were trained on the works of Agatha Christie, I'm sure AI could write Agatha Christie novels or novels in the style. It would be interesting, though, as to whether they were as good as Agatha Christie. I don't know. Um, yeah, my mother used to really like Agatha Christie. Um, but that is the thing. Yeah, absolutely. They're getting better and better and better at and the level of pattern recognition. It is astonishing. What it can do that we can't do as well. But we do have to find those things that we do better. Um, you know, I think hopefully.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Okay, I think I'm aware of time. So is there any last pressing question? Otherwise, maybe we'll call it a day. I'm just looking through the people who are still here. Okay, great. So let me once again take this opportunity to thank Professor Anthony Uhlmann. It's been wonderful to have you here, and I wish we could have you in person and at some point, hopefully in the future, with and without AI or without AI, perhaps we could have an in-person conversation about some of these things here in India. And yeah, I mean, I thank you for your time and the fact that I know it's pretty late in Australia and it's the end of a long day, I'm sure, for you. So without taking more of your time, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a privilege to talk to people. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
good day.
Bye-bye.
See
Yeah.
ya.
Bye, everyone. Bye.